Down this hollow where the creek turns and the timber gives way to stone, there was a cabin and a boy named Samuel Wilson. In 1931, he was found here in the water. The sheriff said accident. Folks knew better.
Mountain thief Emma Wilson stole 20 Moonshiners' gold after they killed her 12-year-old son. The most audacious campaign of theft in Appalachian history and the most cunning act of maternal vengeance the Kentucky mountains had ever witnessed. This is the true story of Emma Wilson. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Perry County, Kentucky, known simply as the Backcountry. Rarely have these hills been without some sort of warfare or smoldering quarrel that was likely at any moment to burst into rifle fire. Hemmed in by the ancient Cumberland Mountains, the early settlers who lived along the North Fork of the Kentucky River and its countless tributaries were cut off from the outside world. And for over 200 years, each succeeding generation remained that way. There were no telephones and the roads were few, and travel was slow and tedious. Indeed, the advance of civilization in the outside world had skirted this mountainous region that had gained the reputation of being one of the most lawless and impenetrable sections in all of America. From the early period when the hardy mountaineers fought the Indians all the way up until the 20th century, the inhabitants of this area had a tendency to take law into their own hands and to hand out justice according to their own ideas. This, no doubt, has been due in part to the fact that law and order has had a hard time trying to gain a foothold in this section of sparsely settled mountains. And during the 1800s and even well into the 1900s, most of the region's inhabitants were farmers who lived a simple existence. Most of them lived in log cabins, surviving by working the thin mountain soil and supplementing their meager incomes with whatever trades they could master. Schools and churches were few and far between. In fact, most children didn't even attend school, and those that did rarely did so for more than just a few months a year. You see, in these mountains, the moonshine trade was king. It was the economic engine that drove everything else, the source of cash money in a region where hard currency was scarce and barter was the normal mode of exchange. A man with a good still and a talent for making whiskey could earn more in a month than a farmer could earn in a year, and the demand for quality mountain liquor seemed inexhaustible. Buyers came from as far away as Lexington and Louisville, willing to pay premium prices for the smooth corn whiskey that only these mountain distillers could produce. The trade made some men wealthy by mountain standards, and it made some men dangerous. The moonshine economy operated according to its own rules, rules that had nothing to do with the laws passed by distant legislatures. Territories were claimed and defended, partnerships were formed and dissolved, and disputes were settled through negotiation when possible and through violence when necessary. The men who rose to prominence in this shadow economy were not merely distillers but businessmen and warlords, commanding networks of producers and distributors, enforcing their will through the loyalty of their followers and the fear of their enemies. They were the true power in these mountains, and they answered to no authority but their own. The woman who would challenge that power was born Emma Jane Collins in 1862, in a cabin on the banks of Troublesome Creek that her grandfather had built with his own hands. She was the fourth of 9 children, raised in the hard school of mountain poverty, and she learned early that survival in these hills required wit as much as strength. By the time she was 10, she could read and write better than most adults in the county, a skill she had taught herself using the family Bible and whatever printed materials she could find. By the time she was 15, she had developed a reputation as the cleverest girl in Perry County, someone whose mind worked in ways that others could not follow. That's right, Emma Collins was not called clever merely because she could read and write. The nickname referred to something deeper, a quality of perception and analysis that set her apart from everyone around her. She could look at a situation and see possibilities that others missed, could predict how events would unfold before they happened, could find solutions to problems that seemed unsolvable. Men twice her age came to her for advice, and they followed that advice because they had learned through experience that Emma was usually right. Her mind was her greatest gift, and she would eventually use it to accomplish something that brute force never could. The origins of Emma's extraordinary mental abilities were a subject of speculation throughout the county. Some attributed them to her maternal grandmother, a woman named Martha Collins, who had been known for similar gifts and who had died before Emma was born. Others believed that Emma had simply been born different, touched by something that set her apart from ordinary people. Whatever the source, the ability was undeniable. Emma could remember everything she read or heard, could calculate figures in her head faster than most men could do with pencil and paper, and could detect lies with an accuracy that made some people uncomfortable in her presence. Her skills had practical applications that made her valuable to her community long before they would be turned to darker purposes. Neighbors came to her when they needed help with contracts or legal documents, knowing that she would understand the fine print that might trip them up. Merchants consulted her when they suspected they were being cheated, trusting her ability to spot discrepancies in accounts and invoices. Even the county clerk had been known to seek her opinion on matters that required more analytical power than he possessed. Emma was an asset to everyone who knew her, a resource that the entire community shared. But Emma's intelligence was not merely analytical. She also possessed a talent for understanding people, for reading their motivations and predicting their behavior. She could meet someone for the first time and know within minutes what they wanted, what they feared, what they would do under pressure. This ability made her an excellent judge of character, someone who could see through pretense and deception to the truth beneath. It was a skill that would prove invaluable in the campaign she would eventually wage against the men who murdered her son. Her marriage to William Wilson in 1880 had been a love match, rare in a culture where marriages were typically arranged for practical rather than romantic reasons. William was a farmer and part-time preacher, a gentleman who lacked Emma's fierce intelligence, but who complimented her in ways that made their partnership remarkably strong. Together, they had built a small farm on a hillside above the river, raising corn and vegetables and the 4 children who came along over the following decade. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable and happy, a family that seemed blessed by fortune in a region where misfortune was more common than not. Among their 4 children, the eldest was a boy named Samuel, born in 1882, who had inherited his mother's quick mind and his father's gentle disposition. Samuel was 12 years old in 1894, a bright and curious child who spent his days helping on the farm and his evenings reading whatever books his mother could borrow or trade for. He had his mother's dark eyes and her way of looking at the world, seeing patterns and connections that others overlooked. Emma had recognized early that Samuel was special, that he had gifts that could take him far beyond these mountains if properly nurtured. She had begun saving money for his education, dreaming of sending him to one of the colleges in Lexington where he could develop his potential. The Wilson farm occupied a strategic position that Emma had not fully appreciated when she and William had first settled there. The hillside above the river offered views in every direction, making it possible to see anyone approaching from miles away. The hollows behind the farm provided natural hiding places that had been used by generations of moonshiners who operated in the area, and the trail that ran past the farm was the main route between several major moonshine operations and the markets where their product was sold. The Wilsons had always maintained a policy of neutrality, seeing nothing and saying nothing about the business that flowed past their door, but neutrality, as Emma would learn, offered no protection when powerful men decided otherwise. Now, to understand what happened in 1894, you need to understand the Moonshine War that had been tearing Perry County apart for nearly 2 years. That's right. 2 rival factions had emerged to dominate the whiskey trade, one led by a man named Elijah Combs and the other by a man named Harrison Strong. The conflict between them had begun over territory, escalated through a series of raids and counter-raids, and eventually claimed over a dozen lives. Both sides were well-armed and utterly ruthless, willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way or who gave aid to their enemies. The entire county had become a battlefield, and the neutral families who tried to stay out of the conflict found themselves caught in the crossfire. The roots of the conflict stretched back years before the open warfare began. Both Combs and Strong had been building their organizations for decades, expanding their territories, recruiting men who would be loyal to them alone. For a time, they had coexisted through an unspoken agreement to respect each other's territories, to avoid direct confrontation that might damage both sides. But the agreement had broken down in 1892, when a dispute over a particularly valuable distribution route could not be resolved through negotiation. The first blood had been spilled in the spring of 1892, when Strong's men ambushed a Combs shipment and killed 2 of the guards escorting it. Combs had retaliated with a raid on one of Strong's stills, burning it to the ground and killing 3 men who had been working there. From that point, the violence had escalated steadily, each attack provoking a response, each response provoking a counter-response. By 1894, the war had consumed everything else in Perry County, making it impossible for anyone to live a normal life. The civilian population had suffered terribly during the 2 years of fighting. Farms had been burned, livestock had been stolen or killed, and families had been forced to flee their homes when they found themselves in disputed territory. The county sheriff had long since given up any pretense of maintaining order, retreating to the county seat and leaving the rest of the territory to the warring factions. Churches had closed when their congregations scattered. Schools had been abandoned when parents refused to let their children travel roads that might be targeted for ambush. Perry County had become a place where only the strong and the ruthless could survive. Elijah Combs was the more powerful of the 2 faction leaders, a man in his 50s who had built his moonshine empire over 30 years of careful work. He controlled over a dozen stills scattered throughout the mountains, employed over 50 men in various capacities, and had accumulated a fortune in gold that was rumored to be the largest in the county. His compound on Carr Creek was a fortress, guarded day and night by armed men who were loyal to the point of fanaticism. Combs himself was a cold and calculating figure, a businessman first and a killer second, who preferred to solve problems through manipulation and economic pressure, but who was entirely willing to use violence when other methods failed. Harrison Strong was younger and more volatile, a man in his 30s who had risen quickly through audacity and brutality. He had fewer resources than Combs, but more willingness to take risks, and his men were bound to him by fear as much as by loyalty. Strong saw the conflict with Combs as an opportunity to seize control of the entire Perry County moonshine trade, and he was willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve that goal. His methods were direct and brutal, and he had developed a reputation for cruelty that made even hardened moonshiners hesitate to cross him. The Wilson family had maintained their neutrality throughout the conflict, refusing to provide information to either side, declining invitations to join one faction or the other, and generally trying to stay invisible in a county where visibility could be fatal. William Wilson had preached neutrality from his pulpit, urging other families to stay out of a conflict that would only bring suffering to everyone involved. His sermons had earned him enemies on both sides, men who saw neutrality as a form of opposition and who resented his calls for peace. But so far, the Wilsons had been left alone, protected by their reputation for integrity and by the general understanding that attacking a preacher would bring bad luck. And that's when everything changed, because Harrison Strong decided that the Wilson farm was too valuable a strategic position to remain in neutral hands. You see, the plan that Strong developed in the spring of 1894 was based on his recognition of the Wilson farm's location. The hillside offered perfect views of the trail that Combs's men used to transport their whiskey to market. Anyone occupying that position could provide early warning of approaching enemies, could count the men and wagons that passed, could gather intelligence that would be invaluable in planning raids. Strong wanted the Wilsons to become his eyes and ears on that trail, and he was prepared to use whatever persuasion was necessary to secure their cooperation. Strong sent men to the Wilson farm in April, 3 rough characters who delivered his proposal with barely concealed threats. The Wilsons would watch the trail and report what they saw to Strong's organization. In exchange, they would receive protection from the violence that was consuming the county and a share of the profits from any successful raids based on their intelligence. The offer was presented as a favor, an opportunity that the Wilsons should be grateful to receive. But Emma Wilson understood immediately what it really was: a demand for allegiance that would make them targets of Combs's faction and would draw them into a conflict they had tried desperately to avoid. William Wilson refused the offer politely but firmly, explaining that his position as a preacher required him to remain neutral in worldly disputes. Emma stood beside her husband, her face revealing nothing of the calculations racing through her mind. The messengers departed with warnings that Strong would not be pleased, that the Wilsons would regret their decision, that neutrality was no longer an option in a county at war. Emma and William discussed the situation late into the night, considering their options. wondering if they should flee the county or if they should stand their ground and hope that Strong's threats were empty. They decided to stay, believing that their reputation would protect them, that even Strong would hesitate to attack a preacher's family. It was a decision that would haunt Emma for the rest of her life, a choice made with incomplete information that led to consequences she could never have anticipated. Looking back, she would wonder what might have happened if they had packed their belongings and left that very night, if they had abandoned the farm that had been their home and started over somewhere else. But they did not leave, and what happened next could never be undone. The attack came 3 weeks later, on a night when William was away preaching at a church in the next county. Emma was alone with the children when she heard horses approaching in the darkness, too many horses moving too fast for any legitimate purpose. She gathered the children and hid them in the root cellar beneath the cabin, a hiding place she had prepared for exactly this kind of emergency. Then she took up a position at the window, her husband's rifle in her hands, determined to defend her family against whatever was coming. But the men who surrounded the Wilson cabin that night were not looking for a fight with Emma. They had come for something else entirely, something that Strong believed would send a message that no one in the county could ignore. They called out for Samuel, demanding that Emma send her eldest son outside, promising that no one else would be harmed if she complied. Emma refused, her finger on the trigger, ready to die rather than surrender her child to men who meant him harm. The standoff lasted for over an hour, the men outside growing increasingly impatient, Emma inside growing increasingly desperate. She could hear them talking among themselves, could hear their frustration building as their demands went unanswered. Some wanted to burn the cabin and be done with it. Others argued that killing a preacher's family would bring too much attention. The leader, a man whose voice Emma did not recognize, kept them in check, insisting that they needed the boy alive to serve as an example. Emma's mind raced through options as the minutes passed. She could try to hold them off until help arrived, but no help was coming. William was miles away, and the nearest neighbors were either asleep or too frightened to intervene. She could try to fight her way out, but she was one woman with a single rifle against a dozen armed men. She could surrender Samuel and hope they would keep their promise not to harm the other children. But she knew better than to trust the word of men who would make such a demand in the first place. The other children were huddled in the root cellar, silent and terrified, following the instructions Emma had drilled into them for exactly this kind of emergency. The cellar had been dug years earlier as a storage space for vegetables and preserved foods, but Emma had always known it might serve another purpose. She had stocked it with blankets and water, had taught the children how to stay quiet and still no matter what they heard, had prepared them for a night like this one, even though she had prayed it would never come. What happened next would be disputed in the accounts that followed, with different witnesses offering different versions of events. What is certain is that Samuel emerged from the root cellar at some point during the standoff, either because he was trying to help his mother or because he was discovered by men who had found the cellar entrance. The men grabbed him before Emma could react, dragging him into the yard where their leader was waiting. Emma screamed and fired her rifle, wounding one of the attackers, but she could not prevent what happened next. They killed Samuel in front of the cabin, in view of the window where his mother stood, as a message to everyone in the county about what happened to families who refused Harrison Strong's offers. The boy was 12 years old, guilty of nothing except being the son of parents who valued their neutrality. His death was meant to terrorize, to demonstrate that Strong would not be defied, to break the will of anyone who might consider resisting his demands. The men rode away into the darkness, leaving Emma alone with her murdered child and her shattered world. The grief that consumed Emma Wilson in the days following Samuel's death was absolute and overwhelming, a darkness that seemed to swallow everything she had ever known or cared about. She barely spoke during the funeral, barely acknowledged the neighbors who came to offer condolences, barely ate or slept as the first terrible week passed into the second. William tried to comfort her, tried to remind her of the 3 children who still needed their mother, tried to pray with her in the hope that faith might offer some solace. But Emma was beyond comfort, lost in a place where no words could reach her. And then, sometime during the 3rd week after Samuel's burial, something changed. The grief did not disappear, would never disappear, but it transformed into something else, something harder and colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Emma emerged from her darkness with a clarity of purpose that frightened everyone who saw it. She knew what she was going to do. She was going to destroy Harrison Strong and everyone who had participated in her son's murder. But she was not going to destroy them with violence. She was going to destroy them with something far more devastating. She was going to take everything they had. You see, Emma Wilson understood something that most people in her position would have missed. That's right. Violence was the language that men like Harrison Strong spoke, the only currency they truly understood. If she tried to fight them with guns and bloodshed, she would lose. She was one woman against an organization of armed men, and no matter how determined she might be, the mathematics were impossible. But there was another kind of warfare, one that she was uniquely suited to wage. She would attack them through their money, through the gold that was the foundation of their power. She would steal from them until they had nothing left. The plan that Emma developed over the following weeks was unlike anything the mountains had ever seen. She would not simply rob Strong and his men. She would systematically identify every moonshiner who had participated in or supported her son's murder, locate where they kept their gold and take it all. She would leave them alive but penniless, stripped of the wealth that made them powerful, reduced to the poverty that they had always inflicted on others. And she would use their own money to build a new life for her surviving children, to give them the opportunities that Samuel would never have. The first step was intelligence gathering, and Emma approached it with the same analytical rigor she applied to everything. She needed to know who had been involved in the attack on her farm, where they kept their money and how that money could be reached. She began visiting neighbors and relatives throughout the county, ostensibly seeking comfort in her grief, actually listening and observing and filing away every piece of information she gathered. People talked freely around a grieving mother, never suspecting that her tear-filled eyes were actually noting everything they said. Within 2 months, Emma had compiled a comprehensive picture of Strong's organization and the men who served it. She knew that 20 men had participated directly in the attack on her farm, and she knew the names and locations of every one of them. She knew that these men kept their gold in various hiding places, some in their homes and some in secret locations throughout the mountains. She knew their routines, their vulnerabilities, their fears. She knew which ones were clever and which ones were careless, and she knew exactly how she was going to take everything they had. The information Emma gathered was recorded in a ledger that she kept hidden beneath a loose stone in her fireplace. Each page was devoted to a single target, documenting everything she had learned about him: where he lived, where he worked, who his associates were, what his habits were, and most importantly, where he kept his gold. She updated these pages regularly as new information came in, building a picture of each target that was more complete than anything they knew about themselves. The sources of Emma's information were varied and often surprising. Wives who had been beaten by their husbands shared details about household finances in moments of bitter candor. Children who had been neglected by their fathers let slip information they had overheard without understanding its significance. Former employees who had been cheated by their bosses were eager to share everything they knew with anyone who would listen. The moonshine underworld was full of people with grievances, and Emma learned to find them and to extract the information she needed. She also developed more direct methods of gathering intelligence. She learned to read tracks and signs that revealed where men had been and what they had been doing. She learned to interpret the patterns of movement on the trails that crisscrossed the county. She learned to identify the hiding places that moonshiners used by studying the terrain and understanding how men thought about concealment. Her analytical mind, which had always been her greatest asset, became a weapon perfectly suited to the campaign she was planning. The plan required patience and precision, qualities that Emma possessed in abundance. She would not strike quickly or randomly. She would choose her targets carefully, beginning with the least important men and working her way up to Strong himself. Each theft would be planned and executed with attention to detail that left nothing to chance. She would never be seen, never be suspected, never give her targets any indication that they were being systematically robbed by the mother of the boy they had murdered. By the time they understood what was happening, it would be too late. And that plan, conceived in grief and executed with brilliance, would make Emma Wilson a legend throughout the mountains of Kentucky. The first theft came in July 1894, 2 months after Samuel's death. The target was a man named Jacob Combs, a distant cousin of Elijah Combs, who had thrown in his lot with Harrison Strong and who had been identified by witnesses as one of the men who dragged Samuel from the root cellar. Jacob kept his gold in a strong box hidden beneath the floorboards of his cabin, a location that Emma had learned from a neighbor whose daughter had once been courted by Jacob's son. The hiding place was considered secure because the cabin was occupied almost constantly. But Emma had also learned that Jacob went to church every Sunday morning, leaving his home empty for several hours. Emma approached Jacob's cabin through the forest, moving silently in the early morning light, while the congregation was gathering at the church 2 miles away. She had studied the layout of the cabin, had identified the window that could be opened from outside, had planned every step of her entry and exit. She was inside within minutes, had located the loose floorboard within minutes more, and was heading back into the forest with Jacob's strongbox before the first hymn had finished. The box contained over $200 in gold coins, more money than most families in Perry County would see in years. Emma buried it in a location known only to herself and returned home before anyone knew she had been gone. Jacob Combs discovered his loss that afternoon and immediately accused his neighbors of the theft. He beat one man nearly to death on suspicion, drove another family from their home, and generally terrorized everyone within a mile of his cabin. But he never suspected Emma Wilson, never imagined that a grieving mother could be responsible for the theft, never connected his loss to the murder he had participated in 3 months earlier. The gold was simply gone, and Jacob had no idea where or how. The second theft came 3 weeks later, targeting a man named Thomas Strong, Harrison's younger brother and one of the leaders of the attack on the Wilson farm. Thomas was cleverer than Jacob and kept his gold in multiple locations, but Emma had learned through patient observation that his largest cache was hidden in a cave on the hillside behind his compound. The cave was guarded during the day, but left unprotected at night. When Thomas assumed that the darkness and the remoteness of the location would deter any thieves, he was wrong. Emma made the journey to Thomas's cave on a moonless night, navigating by memory and by the stars, moving through terrain that would have defeated anyone less determined. She found the cave entrance exactly where her intelligence had indicated, found the gold hidden behind a false wall of stacked stones, and found over $300 in coins and gold dust waiting for her. She took everything, leaving the cave as empty as her heart had been since Samuel's death, and made her way home before dawn. Thomas Strong discovered his loss 2 days later and launched a frantic search that turned up nothing. The pattern was established, and the thefts continued. Emma struck once or twice a month, choosing her targets based on their involvement in her son's murder and their vulnerability to her methods. She never took unnecessary risks, never struck when the odds were against her, never allowed impatience to compromise her careful planning. Each theft was a work of art, executed with precision, that left her victims bewildered and furious but ultimately helpless. They knew someone was robbing them, but they could not imagine who. The third victim was a man named William Maggard, who had supplied the horses used in the attack on the Wilson farm. The fourth was James Dixon, who had held Samuel while others did the killing. The fifth was Robert Combs, another cousin of Elijah who had defected to Strong's faction. Each man lost everything he had saved, everything he had earned through years of dangerous and illegal work, everything he had hoped to pass on to his children. And each man blamed his fellow moonshiners, believing that the thefts were the work of rivals within the organization. That's right. The suspicion and distrust that Emma's thefts created were almost as damaging to Strong's organization as the financial losses themselves. Men who had trusted each other for years began to watch each other with suspicion. Partnerships that had survived decades of shared danger dissolved over accusations of theft. The tight-knit network that had made Strong's operation so effective began to unravel, its members too busy suspecting each other to notice the real threat in their midst. By the end of 1894, Emma had robbed 8 of the 20 men on her list, accumulating over $2,000 in gold that she had hidden in locations throughout the mountains. The money represented security for her surviving children, the education fund that would allow them to escape these hills and build better lives. But more than that, it represented justice, a form of retribution that hurt her enemies where they were most vulnerable. Every coin she took was a blow against the men who had murdered her son, a reminder that their crime would not go unpunished. The investigation into the thefts became increasingly desperate as the losses mounted. Strong himself took charge, questioning his men, searching their properties, trying to identify the thief who was bleeding his organization dry. He tortured several men suspected of betrayal, killing 2 of them before their innocence was established. He posted guards at every location where gold was stored, hired additional men to patrol the roads and trails, and offered a reward of $500 for information leading to the thief's capture. None of it helped. The thefts continued, and Strong's fortune continued to shrink. The genius of Emma's approach lay not just in her skill at stealing, but in her ability to remain invisible. She was a middle-aged widow, a grieving mother, a church-going woman who spent her days tending her farm and her children. No one would ever suspect her of the audacious crimes that were terrorizing the moonshine community. When Strong's men came to question her, as they questioned everyone in the county, she played her role perfectly. She was cooperative but not too cooperative, helpful but not too helpful, a woman who clearly knew nothing about the mysterious thief who was plaguing her neighbors. They left convinced of her innocence, never imagining that they had been speaking to the very person they were hunting. The 9th theft was Emma's most audacious yet, targeting Harrison Strong's own compound on Troublesome Creek. Strong kept his personal fortune in a vault beneath his main cabin, a location protected by armed guards around the clock. The compound itself was a small fortress, with buildings arranged to provide overlapping fields of fire and a network of trails that allowed defenders to move quickly to threatened positions. Strong had designed it himself, drawing on lessons learned from years of warfare with rival factions. He believed it to be impregnable. He was about to be proven wrong. Emma spent 3 weeks studying the compound, learning the guard schedules, identifying the weak points in the security. She observed from a distance during the day and crept closer at night, mapping every building, every trail, every position where guards were posted. She learned the names of the guards and their habits, knew which ones were alert and which ones dozed at their posts, knew which ones were loyal to Strong and which ones were merely collecting pay. She discovered that the guards changed shifts at midnight, and that there was a brief window of perhaps 5 minutes when the vault area was unprotected, as the outgoing guards left and the incoming guards arrived. This window existed because Strong trusted his men to manage the transition efficiently, never imagining that anyone would be watching closely enough to exploit such a brief vulnerability. But Emma was watching, and she saw the opportunity clearly. The preparation for this theft was more extensive than anything Emma had undertaken before. She practiced picking locks on similar mechanisms until she could open them in darkness by feel alone. She rehearsed the approach route until she could navigate it without conscious thought. She timed herself repeatedly, ensuring that she could complete every step of the operation within the 5-minute window. She allowed no margin for error because there would be none when the moment came. It was barely enough time, but it was all she needed. She struck on a night when Strong himself was away, traveling to a meeting with buyers in Lexington. She approached the compound through a drainage ditch that brought her within 30 feet of the main cabin, timed her entry to coincide exactly with the guard change, and was inside the cabin before the new guards had taken their positions. The vault was secured with a lock that would have stopped most thieves, but Emma had anticipated this and had brought tools that she had practiced with for weeks. She had the vault open in under 3 minutes, had emptied its contents into a bag she had brought for the purpose, and was back in the drainage ditch before the guards realized anything was amiss. The haul from Strong's vault was over $500 in gold, the largest single theft of Emma's campaign. But more valuable than the money was the message it sent. Strong's own compound had been penetrated, his own vault had been emptied, and he had no idea how it had happened. His rage when he returned from Lexington was legendary, a fury that resulted in the deaths of 3 of his own men, who he accused of complicity in the theft. The organization that had once been so formidable was tearing itself apart, and Emma Wilson was watching from her hillside farm with quiet satisfaction. The winter of 1894 to 1895 slowed Emma's campaign but did not stop it. She continued to gather intelligence, continued to plan future operations, continued to execute thefts whenever conditions permitted. The 10th victim lost his gold on a snowy December night when he believed the weather would protect him. The 11th was robbed on New Year's Eve while he was celebrating with his family. The 12th was targeted in January, his hiding place discovered through a chance comment overheard at a general store. Each theft added to Emma's growing fortune and subtracted from the resources of the men who had murdered her son. By the spring of 1895, Strong's organization was in crisis. Over half the men who had participated in the attack on the Wilson farm had been robbed, losing a combined total of over $3,000. The morale of the remaining men had collapsed, their trust in each other destroyed by months of accusations and counter-accusations. Several had defected to Elijah Combs's faction, believing that Strong could no longer protect them. Others had simply fled the county, taking what remained of their savings and starting over somewhere else. The empire that Strong had built was crumbling, and he had no idea that a single woman was responsible. The war between Strong and Combs, which had been the dominant feature of Perry County life for years, began to shift in Combs's favor as Strong's resources dwindled. Combs sensed weakness and pressed his advantage, launching raids that Strong lacked the men and money to counter. Territories that Strong had controlled for years fell to his rival. Allies who had once been loyal began to reconsider their allegiances. The power that Strong had accumulated through years of ruthless work was slipping away, stolen literally and figuratively by forces he could not see or understand. And Emma Wilson continued her patient work. You see, the campaign that Emma waged against the Moonshiners was not merely about money, though the money was important. That's right. It was about something deeper, a form of justice that the conventional legal system could never have provided. The men who had murdered Samuel would never face trial for their crime. The sheriff was too corrupt or too frightened to investigate. The courts were controlled by men who depended on the moonshine trade for their income. There was no legitimate path to accountability, no way to make the killers pay through proper legal channels. But Emma had found another way, a path to justice that required no courts and no laws and no officials who could be bought or intimidated. She was taking from the murderers the thing they valued most, the gold that was the foundation of their power and their security. Each theft diminished them, weakened them, brought them closer to the poverty and powerlessness that they had always inflicted on others. It was not the same as seeing them hang for their crime, but it was something. It was accountability of a sort that they could understand. The 13th theft came in April 1895, targeting a man named Daniel Strong, another of Harrison's brothers and one of the most vicious members of the organization. Daniel had personally fired the shot that killed Samuel, a fact that Emma had learned from a witness who had been present that night. She had saved him for special attention, planning a theft that would leave him not merely poor, but humiliated. She broke into his cabin while he slept, took his gold from beneath his own bed, and left a note that said simply, "For Samuel." It was the only time she revealed herself even partially, and she did it because she wanted Daniel to know why he had been targeted. Daniel's reaction to the note was everything Emma had hoped for. He flew into a rage that terrorized his household, beat his wife and children, and then collapsed into a paranoid terror that left him unable to function. He became convinced that he was being haunted by the ghost of the boy he had murdered, that supernatural forces were punishing him for his crime. He began drinking heavily, neglecting his duties to the organization, and within months he was a broken man, stripped of his gold and his sanity by a woman he had never suspected. The 14th and 15th thefts came in quick succession, targeting men who had provided information to Strong about the Wilson family's vulnerability. These men were not killers themselves, but their intelligence had made the attack possible, and Emma held them responsible. She took everything they had, left them destitute, and watched with cold satisfaction as they struggled to rebuild lives that had been built on the suffering of others. They deserved what they got, and she felt no remorse for their fates. The 16th victim was particularly satisfying. He was a man named Charles Combs, a defector from Elijah's faction who had joined Strong specifically because he wanted to participate in the attack on the Wilsons. Charles had bragged about his role in Samuel's death, had told the story repeatedly in taverns and at gatherings, had seemed proud of what he had done. Emma learned where he kept his gold through a woman he was courting, a woman who had no idea that she was providing information to the mother of the boy Charles had helped murder. The theft was surgical, precise, and complete. Charles lost everything, and he never stopped wondering how. By the summer of 1895, Harrison Strong's organization had effectively ceased to exist. 17 of the 20 men who had participated in Samuel's murder had been robbed, and the remaining 3 had fled the county. Strong himself had lost most of his fortune and had been driven from his compound by Elijah Combs's advancing forces. He was a refugee in his own territory, hiding in remote cabins, depending on the charity of men who had once feared him. The transformation was so complete that people who had known him in his prime could barely recognize the broken man he had become. Emma had one more target before her campaign would be complete. Strong himself had escaped her attention for months, constantly moving, never staying in one place long enough for her to plan an operation. But she was patient, and her network of informants eventually provided the intelligence she needed. Strong was hiding in a cabin on the head of Carr Creek, protected by a handful of loyal men who were all that remained of his once formidable organization. He still had gold money he had managed to protect through all the chaos of the past year. Emma intended to take it. The theft from Harrison Strong's final hiding place was the culmination of everything Emma had learned over 15 months of patient work. She studied the cabin for 2 weeks, learning the routines of the guards, identifying the weak points in their security, planning every detail of her approach. The cabin was less fortified than Strong's compound had been, so a simple structure chosen more for its remoteness than for any defensive qualities. But it was still guarded, and the men who remained loyal to Strong were alert and suspicious after months of mysterious losses. Emma observed the cabin from multiple vantage points, building a complete picture of how the guards operated and where the vulnerabilities lay. She noted that the guards were most relaxed in the early morning hours, when exhaustion from the night watch began to take its toll and attention wandered. She noted that supplies were delivered every few days and that the guards' routine was disrupted during these deliveries as they helped unload wagons and inventory goods. She noted that Strong himself rarely left the cabin, staying inside where he felt safest, trusting his men to protect him from dangers he could not see. She would strike on a night when Strong's men were distracted by a delivery of supplies, a delivery that Emma herself had arranged through intermediaries who had no idea of her true purpose. She had hired a trader to bring goods to the cabin, had paid him well enough that he asked no questions, had timed the delivery to arrive just after midnight, when the guards would be at their most fatigued. The timing would have to be perfect, but Emma had become expert at perfect timing. The night of the final theft was warm and moonless, ideal conditions for the kind of work Emma had become so skilled at. She approached the cabin through a creek bed that brought her within yards of the back entrance, waited until the supply delivery had drawn the guards to the front of the property, and slipped inside while Strong himself was distracted by the arrival. She found his gold hidden in a compartment beneath his bed, exactly where her intelligence had indicated. She took everything, over $400 in coins that represented the last of his fortune, and was gone before anyone realized she had been there. Harrison Strong discovered his loss the next morning and understood immediately that his career was over. Without money, he could not pay his remaining men. Without men, he could not protect himself from Combs or from the dozens of other enemies he had made over years of brutal dealing. He tried to flee the county, hoping to start over somewhere else, but Elijah Combs's men caught him on the road to Virginia. What they did to him over the following 3 days was a lesson to everyone in Perry County about the price of losing in the Moonshine Wars. Emma heard about Strong's death with satisfaction, but not joy. Her work was complete, and now she could focus on building the future she had promised her surviving children. The gold that Emma had accumulated over 15 months of systematic theft totaled over $6,000, an almost unimaginable fortune by the standards of Perry County. She used it wisely, investing in land and livestock that would provide income for years to come. She sent her remaining children to schools in Lexington and Louisville, giving them the education that Samuel had been denied. She contributed generously to churches and charities, sharing her stolen wealth with those who needed it most. The money that had been earned through murder and moonshine was transformed into something better, into opportunity and hope for people who had never had either. She never spoke publicly about what she had done, never admitted to the thefts that had destroyed Harrison Strong's organization and transformed the power structure of Perry County. When people asked about the mysterious thief who had terrorized the Moonshiners, Emma shrugged and claimed to know nothing about it. Her secret was kept by the few people who suspected the truth, people who understood that some forms of justice are best accomplished in silence. The legend of the mountain thief grew over the years, but the true identity of that thief remained hidden. The aftermath of Emma's campaign reshaped the moonshine industry in Perry County for a generation. The violence and chaos that had characterized the Strong-Combs War gave way to a more orderly system, one in which disputes were settled through negotiation rather than bloodshed. The men who survived the conflict had learned hard lessons about the costs of the old ways, and they were determined not to repeat the mistakes of their predecessors. The county remained poor and isolated, but it was more peaceful than it had been in decades. Emma Wilson lived another 34 years after completing her campaign, dying peacefully in her bed in 1929 at the age of 67. She had seen her surviving children grow into successful adults, had watched her grandchildren begin lives that would have been impossible without the opportunities she had provided. The farm on the hillside above the river remained in the family, maintained by descendants who knew the story of what their ancestor had done, but who rarely spoke of it to outsiders. The years following the campaign were remarkably peaceful for Emma and her family. With Strong destroyed and his organization scattered, the violence that had plagued Perry County for years gradually subsided. The gold that Emma had accumulated provided security and opportunity that few mountain families could imagine. She invested wisely, buying land when prices were low and selling when they rose, building a modest fortune that grew steadily through careful management. Her surviving children were the primary beneficiaries of this fortune. Emma sent them to schools in Lexington and Louisville, providing educations that opened doors that would have remained closed to ordinary mountain children. Her eldest daughter became a teacher, returning to Perry County to educate the next generation. Her son became a lawyer, eventually serving in the state legislature. Her youngest daughter married a merchant in Louisville and raised a family that never knew poverty. Each success was a victory over the men who had tried to destroy Emma's family, a demonstration that good could come from even the darkest circumstances. Emma herself never remarried after William's death in 1907, preferring to manage her affairs alone and to focus her energy on her children and grandchildren. She remained active in her church, contributing generously to charitable causes and serving on committees that oversaw the distribution of aid to those in need. She was known throughout the county as a woman of substance and integrity, someone whose advice was sought and whose judgment was trusted. Few people connected this respectable matriarch to the legendary thief who had brought down Harrison Strong. The secret of Emma's campaign was kept by the handful of people who knew or suspected the truth. Her children learned the story eventually, told by their mother in careful, measured words that emphasized the justice of what she had done while acknowledging its moral complexity. They were proud of her, even as they understood that her methods could never be publicly celebrated. The story passed down through generations, shared only within the family, a legacy that bound them together and reminded them of what their ancestor had accomplished. Emma herself never expressed regret for the thefts that had defined her life, never apologized for taking from men who had taken so much more from her. When asked about her philosophy by her grandchildren, she would say only that the world did not always provide justice, that sometimes people had to find their own ways to balance the scales. She did not advocate theft as a general practice, but she did not condemn it either, when it was directed against those who had committed far worse crimes. Her moral framework was pragmatic rather than absolute, shaped by experiences that had taught her the limits of conventional ethics. Her grave lies in the cemetery beside the church where her husband William preached, marked by a simple stone that bears only her name and dates. Samuel's grave is nearby, the son whose murder had set everything in motion, the child whose death had transformed a grieving mother into the most successful thief in Perry County history. The two stones stand together, grandmother and grandson separated in life, but reunited in the hillside where generations of their family rest. The story of Emma Wilson passed into legend almost immediately. becoming one of those tales that mountain people told around fires and passed down through generations. Songs were written about her, ballads that celebrated her cunning and mourned the death of her son. Some portrayed her as a hero who had found a way to achieve justice when the legal system failed. Others painted her as a common thief who had used her grief as an excuse for criminal behavior. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple narrative could capture. The songs that emerged from the Emma Wilson story varied widely in their approach and their message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, beginning with Samuel's death and ending with Strong's downfall. Others focused on particular thefts, dramatizing the audacity of Emma's operations or the panic that gripped her victims. The most famous of these songs, known as The Widow's Gold, was composed in 1897 by a traveling musician who had heard the story from people who had known Emma personally. His song has been recorded by dozens of artists over the past century. Historians who have studied the Emma Wilson case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and its meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of gendered resistance, noting that Emma's approach to vengeance reflected strategies available to women in a society where direct violence was considered a male prerogative. Others have focused on economics, seeing in Emma's thefts a redistribution of wealth from the powerful to the powerless that challenged the hierarchies of mountain society. Still others have examined the failures of the legal system, arguing that Emma's campaign demonstrated what happened when formal institutions could not provide justice. You see, what Emma Wilson did occupies an ambiguous place in any moral framework. She was a thief, there is no denying that. She took property that belonged to others, regardless of how those others had acquired it or what they had done to deserve losing it. The men she robbed were criminals themselves, murderers and bootleggers. But that did not make her actions legal or by some measures ethical. She operated outside the law, taking justice into her own hands in a way that society generally condemns. And yet her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that theft is wrong. She was a mother whose 12-year-old son had been murdered by men who would never face any other form of accountability. The system that should have punished those men was too corrupt, too frightened, or too complicit to act. What options did she have? What would any mother do when faced with such impossible loss and such complete absence of legitimate recourse? Her story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The men she robbed had broken laws far more serious than theft, had murdered a child in cold blood, had terrorized an entire county through violence and intimidation. Yet they faced no consequences through the legal system, no accountability for their crimes. Emma imposed consequences where the law could not or would not, achieved accountability through the only means available to her. Was she wrong to do so? The question has no easy answer. The specific circumstances that produced the Emma Wilson story have changed in the decades since her campaign ended. The moonshine industry that once dominated the Kentucky mountains has largely disappeared, replaced by legal distilleries and changing patterns of alcohol consumption. The violence that characterized that industry has faded into history, remembered now mainly through songs and stories that grow more romantic with each retelling. The old mountain communities have been transformed by roads and electricity and education, their isolation broken by forces that Emma Wilson helped set in motion through the opportunities she provided her children. But the underlying questions that her story raises have not disappeared. What do we do when the legal system fails to provide justice? How do we respond when the powerful harm the powerless with impunity? What forms of resistance are available to those who lack conventional power, and are those forms ever justified? These questions persist because the conditions that generate them persist, because law and justice remain imperfectly aligned, because systems continue to fail the people they are supposed to protect. The descendants of Emma Wilson still live in those Kentucky hills, carrying a name that evokes both pride and complexity. Some have embraced the family legacy, researching the history and preserving the stories for future generations. Others have focused on the legitimate success that Emma's stolen gold made possible, the education and opportunity that transformed her family's trajectory forever. All of them, in one way or another, have been shaped by events that occurred over a century ago, a campaign of theft that defined their family in ways that cannot be escaped or forgotten. The farm on the hillside above the river remains in family hands to this day, though it has been modernized and expanded over the generations to meet changing times. The view that once allowed Emma to watch the moonshine trails now looks out over a landscape transformed by development and change. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama, keeping their secrets as they have always kept them. The mountains of Perry County remain today much as they were in 1894, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The creeks still flow cold and clear, the trees still change color each autumn, the hollows still shelter families whose names have been associated with this land for generations. The moonshine industry is gone, but the memory of it lingers in place names and family stories, and the ruins of old stills that can still be found if you know where to look. Those who live in these hills still tell stories about Emma Wilson, about the campaign of theft that brought down a moonshine empire, about what happens when a mother's love transforms into something the world has rarely seen. The story of Emma Wilson endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of maternal love and what that love becomes when it is violated by unspeakable cruelty. It is the story of cleverness and determination, of a mind that found solutions where others saw only impossibility. It is the story of justice and its alternatives, of what happens when the systems designed to provide accountability fail and people find other ways to balance the scales. It is, finally, a story without easy categories, a tale that resists simple judgments and invites reflection on questions that have no comfortable answers. Emma Wilson showed that vengeance need not be written in blood, that there are other ways to destroy those who would destroy us. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Emma Wilson stood, to see the farm she defended and the graves where she and Samuel rest together on the hillside above the river? Would you walk the path she walked, breathe the same mountain air, feel the same wind that has blown through these hills since before humans came to settle here? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the hollows where Emma conducted her campaign are difficult to access without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it. That standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The farm still stands, maintained by descendants who preserve not just the buildings, but the memory of what happened there over a century ago. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of Emma Wilson close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. Her story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Perry County in 1894, as long as mothers love their children with a ferocity that defies reason, as long as systems fail and people find ways to respond. She is gone now, dust mingling with the earth of the hillside she loved, but what she did and what was done to her family echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. Her legacy lives on in the descendants who bear her name and in the stories that preserve her memory. And that, my friend, is the true story of Emma Wilson, the mountain thief who stole gold from 20 moonshiners after they killed her 12-year-old son Samuel on a spring night in 1894. A story of love and loss, of cunning and perseverance, of justice found where the law could not provide it. She proved that strength comes in many forms, that the mind can be as powerful as any weapon, and that a mother's determination can overcome obstacles that would defeat armies. The mountains remember, and through them, so shall we all.